I got interested in the background story of our taxes, and you're going to hear a little bit about that today. The subject is medicinal alcohol. And I thought everybody would enjoy this picture as a start to my presentation. We're not going to start with national prohibition. We want to go back to the Civil War era. I grew up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. One of my great aunts married a Hostetter up there. Dr. Jacob Hostetter was a doctor in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and he gave a prescription that was mostly alcohol. And when he retired, his son and somebody else moved out to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and started marketing that as Hostetter's Celebrated Stomach Bitters. There was a tax on that during the Civil War era. I haven't shown you the picture of that tax stamp, but they went to the government, along with a lot of other companies, and had tax stamps just for them. And that thing at the top, after the tax was eliminated in the middle of 1883, they continued to put that strip across the top of their bottles of Celebrated Stomach Bitters, and that was their trademark. And if anybody wanted to benefit from their name and their notoriety, they could get them into court for violating trademark. When the Spanish-American War came about, we again started taxing over-the-counter medications, and the thing at the bottom, the strip before, there was a 2.5 cent tax on their bottles of Hostetter's Celebrated Stomach Bitters. I should also mention that the Union Army ordered this stuff by the railroad carload. And with all the presentations recently that we've had here on the Civil War, I'm curious whether anybody has looked to see whether or not it was that reason that the Union won the Civil War. I don't know, what do you think? Lydia Pinkham. Oh, let us drink to Lydia Pink. And her love for the human race. She invented a vegetable compound, and the papers published her face. It's about 88 proof. And it was advertised as a medication for women during menopause, or during their period. By the way, when we come up to the 1905 and the Pure Food Law, they had to start including what the ingredients were in all these over-the-counter medications, and they reduced the amount of alcohol in Lydia Pinkham's preparation. By the way, I have read that it is still being marketed today without any alcohol. That's a tax stamp for a $1 bottle. It was a 2.5 cent tax per dollar. In the late 19th century, there was a lot of movement in this country to try and enact prohibition. All of that was done at the state level. And as a matter of fact, the state of Maine in the 1880s entered prohibition. Alcohol was forbidden in the state of Maine as early as the mid-1880s. I believe it was 1886. Okay. In 1908, a very significant election in Ohio took place. A number of people were elected to Congress, and their campaign featured, "Let's bring about prohibition." And that really changes what's going on and begins the movement at the national level to establish national prohibition. That did not prevent other states from going into prohibition. As a matter of fact, our neighboring state of Virginia went into prohibition in 1916. The head of the family, should I say the male head of the family, was permitted and had to get a permit to purchase alcohol for the use of his family. And there was a 5-cent fee that they had to file this with the local county court in the state of Virginia. So there's one of my tax stamps. It's a state tax stamp. The 18th Amendment was passed and became effective in January of middle of January 1920. They did not want to put into the amendment the definition of intoxicating liquor. That was placed in a law, so it wouldn't be so that the constitutional amendment would not be challenged on that basis. Senator Volstead created the definition for intoxicating liquor, anything over 0.5%, and that was passed in 1919. And so here we have, some of you may remember Schaefer beers coming out of Brooklyn, New York, and this is a malt tonic. It contained 0.5%. A number of the breweries tried to market this stuff. It was highly unsuccessful during national prohibition, but they tried this. Pabst. Now this is an extract. It had particles in it, okay? And malt extracts could be marketed up to 3.76% alcohol. But they contained 18% solids. Anybody care to have a drink? Maybe a chew? This also was highly unsuccessful. Now, the federal government established that you could obtain a prescription for medicinal alcohol, and this began at the beginning of national prohibition in January 1920. This is one of the first prescription blanks that were produced by the government and were used by physicians in order to prescribe spiritus frumenty. Anybody that's taken Latin knows that that means the spirit of the grain, okay? And I want you to, now, 19th Amendment was also passed right after the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment was national prohibition. Anybody know what the 19th Amendment was?
Suffrage.
Suffrage, giving women the right to vote. Now look at the prescription. We've got his name, give the full name of the patient, and underneath there, where the address, it says his address. Oh, well, we're only going to prescribe this stuff to men, right? By the way, they very quickly, when they ran out of these, the next ones they printed, they got rid of the word his. Spiritus frumenty, wonderful stuff. This is an ink blotter. American Medicinal Spirits Company. That was used at a whiskey distillery previously, but since now the only thing that you could sell legally was medicinal alcohol, they changed the name of the distillery to the American Medicinal Spirits Company. Here's another prescription a little bit later. This was filled in a pharmacy in Sacramento, California. And up there in the upper left, what are they prescribing? You didn't know the medicinal product of gin, its medicinal properties, did you? Right. No doubt for adding to quinine, right? From the same pharmacy, what's prescribed here? Rum. Can you imagine what the back room of this pharmacy must have looked like? If they were able to fill, I'm sure they were able to fill prescriptions for spiritus fermenting, or whiskey, gin, rum. How about this? You didn't know the medicinal, French brandy. It's not from the same pharmacy, but I'm sure that that pharmacy in Sacramento probably could have filled a prescription for French brandy. Not just brandy, French brandy. And this is fairly late. This is from 1933. Okay, yes, it's for a woman, Mildred. Yes. Okay. I don't know if I included it, but I've got one for French champagne as well. Texas was not satisfied with the federal government's regulation. They required their own prescription in addition to the federal prescription. And so here we have the two prescriptions, one, the federal. You notice they look different, by the way. They change these frequently. This is the third version of a federal prescription for medicinal alcohol. And then we have the simple Texas one as well. So you have to take both the prescriptions to the pharmacy in order to get them filled. So the prescriptions for medicinal alcohol could not exceed a pint for a month. A pint for a month. Now I used to, it was mentioned I'm a stamp collector, and back in the 1990s, I was working for a stamp dealer at a show in Madison Square Garden, a stamp show. And somebody came in, the person I was working for was busy with another customer, and somebody came in with a stack. Oh, that isn't this one. I'll save that story for later. This is a prescription that was filled in a pharmacy in Brooklyn, New York, and there was a watermark in the paper of the federal prescriptions. You could hold it up, and you could see the word prohibition in the watermark. This doesn't have a watermark. I have about 5 of these. They're from different physicians, but they're all filled at the same pharmacy in Brooklyn, New York. So somebody was busy, maybe the pharmacist, I don't know who did it, but was going around. The physician could get a book, that contained the prescription blanks, and a physician could only prescribe could issue so many prescriptions per month. They were limited. They didn't want somebody just writing prescription blanks and handing them out. They were limited. So obviously in Brooklyn, somebody said, well, we could make up these prescription blanks. We can distribute them to the physicians, and you don't have to worry about the limit that the federal government has placed on you. It isn't listed, the prescriptions were not limited to distilled spirits. You could also get wine. And here is a prescription for sherry. I have prescriptions for port. And as a matter of fact, the first two that I acquired were to two women in a suburb of New York City, both at the same pharmacy, one for port and the other for sherry. They were from the same community. My suspicion was that the ladies were going to have a wine tasting at their place, and they went to their physician to get sherry and port in order to have their wine tasting at their house. Churches and synagogues could also order wine for sacramental purposes. This one is interesting. This is from the Novitiate of Los Gatos in California. They no longer exist, but one of the things that the priests did there was to supply altar wines, and this was almost certainly placed on a barrel of about 50.5 gallons. Now, I suspect that these were ordered perhaps in a Catholic diocese, and they probably split it up in order to distribute it within the diocese. I'm not sure. But this is a really nice artifact from the Prohibition years. They are not the only ones that produced altar wines during Prohibition. It was a big business. Now, in order for anybody to sell alcohol for beverage purposes, you had to have from the federal government this is called it says, at the top says special tax stamp. And annually they had to pay $25 in order to sell distilled spirits. This was almost certainly a pharmacist who was filling prescriptions. The story behind special tax stamp. This looks like a license, right? This sort of looks like a license. Well, during the Civil War, they had licenses at the federal level for retailing distilled spirits. And there were places that had local prohibition, and a number of cases got to the federal Supreme Court because people were selling alcohol in those local municipalities. And they said, the federal government allows us to do it. They used the word license. So it got all the way to the US Supreme Court. It initially was challenged at the state level, and they got it over into the federal courts. It goes to the US Supreme Court, and at the end of the session, they go to Congress and say, we aren't going to decide it now, but in the fall, when we reopen in the next session of the Supreme Court, you are going to lose this case. Congress said, well, we're really enjoying the amount of money that we are collecting for these licenses for selling distilled spirits, liquor. So what they did was they essentially waved their hand over the law and said, once a license, now a special tax stamp. And they continued to collect that until the first decade of this century. It was eliminated during the second Bush administration. Okay, this is a stamp that went over the top of a bottle. It is a green one. And some of you may remember that we used to have red strip stamps over the tops of all of our liquor bottles to indicate that the tax had been paid. Those red strip stamps came into use in 1934, February of 1934. But in 1897, Congress established something called bottled in bond. In other words, when they made whiskey, they put it in barrels, charred on the inside, giving the whiskey color and some change in flavoring. They were allowed to keep it in a bonded warehouse under lock and key of the government and not pay the tax for 7 years. But at the end of 7 years, they had to pay the tax. As they changed the amount of time that you could delay the payment of the tax, they permitted, and this is the beginning of bottling of distilled spirits. Bottled in bond, it is kept in a bonded warehouse under a government lock. I didn't bring one of those locks along, but they're very interesting locks. They had a little door over the keyhole, and there was a paper seal that covered the keyhole so they could see if anybody had tried to tamper with the lock. And all the medicinal spirits that were to be sold at the beginning of Prohibition had to come from that it was distilled before January 1920. And so much of the distilled spirits that were sold under prescription were bottled in bond prior to Prohibition. Now, they could have been bottled during Prohibition, but the distilling process took place before Prohibition began. They could only bottle in half pints and pints. The distilleries apparently had a pretty good supply of whiskey, and they convinced the government to allow them to bottle it in quarter pints, 4 ounces, because they marketed that directly to physicians. And physicians, if you went in to get your prescription filled, they could give you a quarter pint so that you could be on your road to recovery before you were able to fill your prescription at the pharmacy. Now, I remember as a teenager going in and the doctor prescribing something for me, not alcohol, and giving me pills. And those were to tide me over until I could fill my prescription at the pharmacy for the medication that was being prescribed for me. So that idea dates from the Prohibition years. The pharmaceutical companies loved marketing their products this way. They give them out free samples, and that way the doctor could give you a sample of your prescription before you were able to fill it. In 1926, we had some reorganization going on in the federal government, and they established the Bureau of Prohibition, and they changed the green bottled and bond tax stamps, and this is an example of one of those. This is for 1 pint. By the way, you can get these in pints half pints and quarter pints. The quarter pints and pints are relatively available for collectors. But finding the half pint, look, if you're going to your doctor for a prescription of alcohol, you don't want a half pint. If the limit is a pint, you want the pint. And these were placed on the cases of the medicinal alcohol, and they have case stamps with a serial number on the stamp. This is a new thing. They never had these before, and they eliminated them after Prohibition. But they wanted to see where these things came from when they were investigating cases of illegal operations. Now, we know that during Prohibition, there were also moonshiners, right? Those are the guys that make their distilled spirits out there in the woods. A well-known rye whiskey was made up in the Baltimore area, Melvale. That's not a very nice looking stamp at the top. I want you to look how Melvale is spelled up there. M-E-L-L. Now look at the bottle label at the top. There's only one L there, M-E-L-V-A-L-E. These are both counterfeit. They were trading off somebody else's name. Yeah. And it's how we can fool the consumer. This is a blue one. This is for alcohol that was exported, and this is a counterfeit as well. And so they put this on to try to tell you, if you're interested in purchasing it, we smuggled this back just for you. But it is a forgery. All right, here's a prescription. Where was it filled? At Jackson Pharmacy on Tillman Island. And who was it filled for? That family name sound familiar? Mrs. Harrison. Here's another one from Tillman Island. For Sally Fluharty. Sound familiar name from down there in Talbot Island? A year or two ago, they opened a new museum down on Tillman Island. I had a number of these prescriptions, and I took my prescriptions down and I said to the docent who gave us a tour, I think the museum needs one of these prescriptions that was filled at the Jackson Pharmacy. Why don't you page through here and pick one of them out? So she started paging through and she said, oh, that one was my aunt. And the next one was her uncle. I said, you need two for the museum down there. Okay, that's the story of Prohibition. I will add one other thing. That's the last picture you're going to see. Franklin Roosevelt ran one of his planks in his campaign was to eliminate the 18th Amendment, to get rid of the 18th Amendment. He was elected. He was inaugurated at the beginning of March 1933. It was already scheduled for various states to vote on whether or not to get rid of the 18th Amendment, and they knew you had to have so many that were going to say yes. They knew that the last time that there would be a vote taken in the state of Utah would put them over the limit on December 5th, 1933. And that is the date on which national prohibition was ended. Roosevelt wasn't entirely happy with that, and so he went to Congress, and on March 22nd, 1933, they changed the Volstead Act from 1919, the definition of what is an intoxicating beverage. Remember I said it was anything that exceeded a half of 1%. They changed it to anything exceeding 3.2% alcohol. And that's where we get 3.2 beer. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
In your first couple slides there, you had the 2.5 cent cost for the stamp. Now the one, it was, the second one I think was the 88 proof stuff.
Yeah.
What was the proof of the first one?
About 90. Now,
So,
first of all, those were medicinal products. They were not taxed as alcohol. They were taxed based on, since they were marketed as medicinal medicines, they were taxed based on the retail value of the product.
so the proof didn't enter into the...
The proof did not enter it into it at all. Now, that all changes by prohibition, and there was a distilled spirits tax on all those prescriptions that were filled. Okay? So they got rid of that, but in the Civil War era and in the Spanish-American War era, anything that was marketed as a medication, an over-the-counter medication, was taxed at a certain rate based on the retail value. 1/8 of a cent on 10 cents, and for 25, if it was 25 cents, it was 5/8 of a cent. 4 times that is 2.5 cents that we saw. So that was marketed at $1 probably. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that for medicinal spirits, they had to be distilled prior to 1920. So that means that there was enough medicinal spirit to last for 13 years.
I think they actually changed that relatively late in Prohibition, but it was probably they had probably 10 years worth of distilled spirits that had been distilled, not necessarily ready for consumption.
No, raw
Yeah.
distillation.
Yeah. Yes.
So your stamps that went on the bottles, yours were whole, and I was just wondering how would you get them whole? Because normally, you open up the bottle and then they break the seal, and the stamp. I was just kind of curious how.
Originally, they could be soaked off before you opened the bottle. However, in later years, they started using heat-sensitive glues. So you could get an iron out,
Okay.
and you could get them off. Yes?
You said that several of the stamps that you showed us were counterfeit. How do you know what's real and what's not?
Well, they don't have first of all, the actual stamps were from engraved plates, and you can run your fingernail over them, and you can feel the rise of the ink on them. If they were done by offset printing, you can run your finger over and it's really smooth. That's one thing. The quality of them is very poor, of the counterfeits, and the genuine stamps were watermarked. So you could hold them up to the light, and if there was no watermark, you knew that it was counterfeit. So there are a couple of ways, but usually they're very crude. Yeah.
Did they use special paper for those stamps like they did for currency?
Well, it's watermark paper. I mean,
Is it a special rag content like crane paper in
No.
Massachusetts makes
No.
currency?
Yeah, no. If you go back to the Civil War era, the stamps were printed sometimes with silk threads in them, yes. There is a pink paper, but later on by the end of the 1870s, they were ordering paper that was watermarked. They thought that was easier to get away from people trying to counterfeit them. Yeah. Oh, I should have said, I have counterfeits of those broad ones. The story that I started telling about something else, somebody came in to the New York Stamp Show and had a stack of those 1 pint stamps. And the dealer I was working for was busy with another customer, so I looked at it and I held it up to the light and there was no watermark. So I knew they were counterfeit, and I gave them, when I handed them over to the dealer, I said, Eric, they're counterfeit. They're all counterfeit. They're pretty decent counterfeits. And he bought all of them. At that point, finding a counterfeit was fairly difficult to find, but this guy had stacks of them. And he asked this guy person, where'd you find these? He says, oh, I was helping demolish a building over in Hoboken, New Jersey, and we found these in the wall. He brought some in the next day, and those are the majority of the counterfeits that we have today. By the way, they were printed with 3 different distillers' names on them. So out of the bathtub, we'll fill this bottle, and we'll call it that one. We'll fill this bottle, it's that one, and so on. But yeah, there's wonderful stories behind a lot of these things, just like the counterfeit prescription in Brooklyn. They're all from, the only ones I've ever seen are from, filled at the same pharmacy in Brooklyn. Yeah.
Yes. I guess afterwards, that was on the federal level, but didn't almost immediately counties or whatever become dry, I guess, they could outlaw or have their own prohibition, right? I guess it continues to this day. They can still do it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. I've collected some things from another state, Georgia, and Georgia has a state tax on distilled spirits, and I believe in the early 1960s, maybe the late 1950s, the Georgia legislature decided that if you wish to not be a dry county or a dry town, you had to tax the beer as well. And so we have decals from lots and lots of counties and towns in the state of Georgia from that particular period of time.
Wasn't Georgia pretty dry, I think?
I don't know.
I don't remember that.
Yeah. Yes.
From the bootlegging, what percent bother to actually put counterfeit stamps on versus just going around all the time?
I don't know. Yes.
Were all the doctors permitted to write prescriptions for those medicinal spirits?
That was up to the state. There are states that did not permit it until relatively late. West Virginia was one of those states that waited until, I believe, 1932 before you could get prescription spirits. And they remained a dry state past 1933, and they continued to use prescriptions, not the federal prescriptions, but there were state prescriptions, and there were little things put on the bottles that indicated that they were sold in West Virginia, and there was a tax on them. Yeah. Yes.
As I recall, the Bible Belt had laws where you couldn't sell liquor on Sundays. We were in Missouri for a year, and we went into a grocery store, and the whole section of liquor was all taped out. You couldn't go to that section on Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's certainly true. To the best of my knowledge, only one state taxed alcohol, wine, or beer, and that was Missouri before Prohibition. And then by the time of the 30s, the states were desperate to raise funds for for all their social programs during the 30s, and almost all the states that went off Prohibition established alcohol taxes. Yes.
Just wonder if you're, I missed the very beginning, sorry, I don't know if you might talk about this, but I've always been curious about, I wonder if you found anything in your efforts and collections about what the mental state, what the societal state of the country that led to Prohibition being a thing when there's clearly so much demand for alcohol. Virtually, it seems to me, everybody, was looking for an angle to get alcohol, but then they,
Another story from my home state of Pennsylvania. A number of years ago, I found licenses for selling distilled spirits during the early years of Prohibition, 20, 21, and 22. And they were signed by the clerk of court in Berks County, Pennsylvania. I said to myself, that's strange. We've got national prohibition. How can they do that? And I was up at the University of Delaware, and in the library, my wife was taking a course up there, and the graduate assistant that was working in the library found me a paper that was written on the situation in Pennsylvania during the first years of Prohibition. The governor didn't want Prohibition, and so he said to the federal government, if you wish to enforce Prohibition in Pennsylvania, you go ahead and enforce it. We are not going to enforce it. And so in Pennsylvania, there was a lot of sale of alcohol during those first 3 years. They elected a pro-prohibition governor, and they went and he convinced the legislature of Pennsylvania to enact a state prohibition law. And when he put in the budget money for enforcement, the legislature lined that out of the budget. So the governor went to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, headquartered in Ohio, who funded the state of Pennsylvania for enforcement of state prohibition. Now the problem that arose was that lawyers who were helping the defendant would get into the court and say to the officer that was testifying, so you went into this bar, how many drinks did you have? Can we trust your testimony? Oh, and how many drinks did you buy for the ladies of the night that were in the bar there? The Women's Christian Temperance Union did not like the publicity that they got out of that, and so they eventually withdrew their support of enforcement of prohibition in Pennsylvania. But that was all written by a professor at one of the colleges up in Baltimore. Yeah. Thank you all for coming.